Chapter 16 looks at adolescent development from the psychosocial perspective. So one of the first things we want to look at is what is the definition of identity? And that is the consistent definition of oneself as a unique individual in terms of their roles, attitudes, beliefs, and aspirations of the individual. So on this slide right here, we take a look at Erikson's fifth stage of development, and that is when the person is trying to figure out the question, who am I? And what can be difficult about answering that question is it can be difficult for the adolescent to decide on the roles that they should adopt, or so that's called identity versus role confusion. That's what Erikson defined it as. And just really quick here, I put this in red, I highlighted this in red, and this is identity achievement. And that's just the point at which the person understands who he or she is as a unique individual in accordance with their past experiences and future plans. Few other terms here, just really quickly. We'll take a look at these. Role confusion, that's also known as identity diffusion. And that's just when the person does not seem to know or care what his or her identity is. And the term foreclosure, that refers to a premature identity formation. That's the adolescent adopts like parents or societal roles, and without really questioning or analyzing them. And last here, moratorium, and that's the socially acceptable way to postpone making identity achievement decisions. And they give an example here, like going to college is a common example. So like, I'm just a student here, and I'm not worried about really who I am or what I'm going to do quite yet. And we're going to take a look at 4 areas of adolescent identity formation. And the first one is religious identity. And they just mentioned that adolescents, they'll accept broad outlines of parental and cultural religious identity. And it may be a time, though, when specific religious beliefs, may begin to be questioned during their adolescence. The second area is political identity. And this just refers to where they lie on the political spectrum. The third area is vocational identity, basically just what they would like to do in life, what they're going to do for their career or something of that effect. Now, feel free at any time during this video to stop the video, pause it, and take a little look at each slide a little more in depth if you so desire. The fourth area of identity formation is sexual identity. And what is most important on this slide is gender identity. And that leads to, their gender role. And so they mentioned many adolescents, they begin to question aspects of their gender identity. So we're going to move on here. So there's a term called gender dysphoria, and that's a strong and persistent cross-gender identification. And they say that people will become distressed at their biological gender. And that is what gender dysphoria here is, the term that is used in the DSM-5. And taking a little further on this gender dysphoria right here, I highlighted in red what I feel is the most important here. And so just remember the term gender dysphoria, that is a term used in the DSM-5. And it states that it's a diagnosis that describes the distress individuals may feel as a consequence of feeling that they are in the wrong body. Okay, so for adolescents, relationships with adults may definitely be different than when they were younger and growing. Maybe a little more conflict with parents, bickering, and uninvolved parenting they refer to. And that's when teenagers start to feel that they don't need their parents any longer. They can, be a little more on their own. Now, there's cultural differences that occur during adolescence, for sure. And one of these they mention, in cultures that value harmony, that adolescent contradictions are not quite as apparent. So they ask the question, does this mean that adolescent rebellion is a social construction? And so if you'd like to consider why you feel that's true or why it's not, feel free to stop the video and think about that. Now, relationships within the family. So these are definitely different for males and females, especially during adolescent phases. And so adolescents are more dependent on their parents if they are female and from a minority ethnic group. That's quite an interesting claim there. And so that can be, a healthy thing or it can be repressive, and so down below here at the bottom of this slide, what's important is parental reactions are very crucial. So definitely during the adolescent stage, too much parental criticism and control, yeah, that actually might stop or hinder dialogue and not improve communication and behavior. And closeness within the family, so family closeness is crucial, and that especially in the form of open communication, and support, connectedness, and control. So yeah, let's move on. So relationships with peers, so definitely how adolescents, their relationships with peers, become very important at that stage of development. So here are 4 terms: peer pressure, selection, facilitation, and deviancy training. Please stop the video and take a look at these and make sure you understand the differences and definitions of each of these. And the development of romance during during adolescent years can be definitely becomes important at this stage of development. So we're going to take a look for here. So definitely, things like first love. First romances appear in high school generally, and usually they're kind of short-lived. That is a generalization. That's not true for everyone. And so females usually will develop, or claim steady partners more often than do boys. And breakups and crushes are more common. And definitely when adolescents feel rejection, that can be quite crushing to them, and it can, for some, that can lead to depression and contemplative suicide and things of that nature. Now, these, of course, are not true for everyone, but it does affect each individual differently. Okay, so we take a look at same-sex romance, and so definitely culture and cohort, those are very influential and powerful. Sexual orientation during that phase of development, so that just refers to whether a person is sexually and romantically attracted to others of the same sex, the opposite sex, or both sexes. So it can be strong, weak, overt, or secret, or unconscious. And its sexual orientation has been found to be fluid during teen years. Now, there's a lot of influence, from the media, says there's a strong correlation between exposure to media sex and adolescent sexual initiation. And also from parents, so in regard to parents, they usually will, tend to wait a little too long to discuss sex and sexual things with their adolescents. And it says, that, warm, open communication is, can be most effective. Okay, so sex education from one's peers. Okay, so adolescent sexual behavior is usually very strongly influenced by their peers. And so it depends on the group too, so they give some examples, like all members of a clique may be virgins or all may be sexually active. So that can be definitely influential on each adolescent. Okay, so when it comes to things like sadness and anger, during the adolescent stage of development, things like depression can be start to come to being. And so during that age group, self-esteem for boys and girls, it really dips at puberty. And so depression becomes pretty common, and so what's really important, is family and peer support, that's extremely influential, and cultural contexts are definitely influential. So one important term here, and I highlighted it in red here for you to demonstrate this is something to pay attention to, but the term major depressive disorder, that is a term used by psychologists, and it's in the DSM-5, but that refers to depression. And so what defines major depressive disorder is deep sadness and feelings of hopelessness, lethargy, and worthlessness. And there's various reasons, various factors that can cause that. They can be both biological and psychological, like stress, genes, and things, that one will ruminate about with one's peers. Okay, and so another issue that can happen with during this stage of development, is suicide, especially if things like peer pressures, bullying, or depression that is not dealt with, that can lead to that. Please, feel free to stop here if you'd like to take a look a little more in depth into the definitions of each of these terms here. Okay, so also in adolescence, delinquency and disobedience usually, will be greatly demonstrated during this phase of development. And of course, in red here, I highlighted that externalizing and internalizing behaviors are really closely connected in adolescence, more so than at any other age. That's something to keep in mind. And so now we begin to discuss drug use and abuse in adolescence. And so drug use becomes a little more widespread from around age 10 to age 25, and then it will generally start to decrease after that. And so adolescent boys generally use a little more drugs and use them more often than do girls. And gender differences, they are reinforced by social constructions about proper male and female behavior. Okay, so here we're just going to take a look at some certain drugs that are used, begin to be used during adolescence, and how their effect on development. So in regard to tobacco, I highlighted a couple things of the main important things that slows down growth. And second, that can damage developing hearts, lungs, brains, and reproductive systems. And the next drug is alcohol. And so I highlighted here that heavy drinking, it may permanently impair memory and self-control by damaging the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Next drug up is marijuana. And so what is most important on this slide is marijuana affects memory, language proficiency, and motivation. So what works best in preventing drug abuse? And on this slide here, they talk about, that anti-drug curricula and advertising campaigns and things of that nature, those can actually result in increased drug use because the ads sometimes they will actually show teenagers how to be defiant. And also adolescents, they'll just recognize that sometimes commercials or campaigns or whatever can be greatly exaggerated. Okay, so and what works? What really helps adolescents to, or actually helps in the decrease of drug abuse in adolescence? And few things here. One is generational forgetting, and that just refers to the idea that each new generation forgets what the previous generation learned. So actually, that's just refers to maybe one generation will be really interested and engaged in certain drug use, whereas the next generation just simply is not, and it's not propagated within peers. And massive ad campaigns and definitely parental example have been found to be really good and effective in preventing adolescent drug use. And so that is all for this chapter. Please, if you'd like to review this, stop on certain slides and look a little more in depth, and also refer to these slides while you answer your study guides, and please use your textbook while doing that as well.